All right, well, our next speaker is Nichoe Lichen from Santa Fe. Nichoe is a veteran organizer for economic justice and for environmental and civil rights, an adoption social worker by profession. In 2011, she co-founded WeArePeopleHere, and some of you may know Craig, what's his last name? Craig Barnes, who was originally from Colorado and played a major role in getting public banking going and other financial progress in New Mexico. But Nichoe was a co-founder of WeArePeopleHere and Banking on New Mexico, which lead the movement for public banking in New Mexico and Santa Fe. And Santa Fe has been the furthest along in its efforts to get a public bank in the country. And that included an international public banking symposium in Santa Fe in 2014. She leads the effort for a Santa Fe public bank and is a board member of the Public Banking Institute. So let's welcome Nichoe.
Thank you. Who was the economy of scale guy? Yeah, good. Okay. And I'm going to speak on that tonight. Our organization, WeArePeopleHere, comes from a quote of Jose Rizal in The Cry for Philippine Independence and Dignity, and it's, we're people here. We deserve to be treated with respect. And in Santa Fe, we've been actually, how we came to this was Craig was giving lectures in a bookstore for about a dozen weeks. And afterwards, we all organized into groups, action groups, learning groups, art groups, all dedicated to finding the root of plutocracy and what was the most effective way to intervene to return democracy and equality and dignity to all people. And we had huge meetings for months where we all sat around and asked each other, what's the root? You know, what's the single most important place that if we all put our weight behind it, we could make a difference for democracy and a fair economy? And someone would say, well, it's term limits, or it's money out of politics, or it's a guaranteed annual income, or it's some kind of fair housing and food. And Craig went away to his cabin in Colorado, as he did every August, and spent a month there on retreat. And he came back and he said, guess what? It's the banks. And I thought, oh, darn, because I don't even balance my checkbook. I'm a social worker by profession. I just let them win unless it's really bad. But I also knew that it was true, what he said. And if you understand that that's also true, then you can be inspired to learn and do things that you never thought you could on behalf of equality and dignity and opportunity and respect for all people. So in 2011 it was founded. Then in 2012, someone emailed me and said, well, what about the Bank of North Dakota? And I thought, what is that? And he said, well, that's a public bank. And I said, well, what is that? And then I looked it up, and I thought, wow, that's really neat. And so I think in like November or October of 2012, I did a presentation on the similarities between New Mexico and North Dakota. And let's see, culturally, North Dakotans were settled by Norwegians. Just like New Mexico is primarily Hispanic and Native people in culture, but what they have in common is the value for family and community and working together. And however, it kind of ended there. I mean, well, the other thing is that they're largely a rural state. They have a few big urban areas, and then the rest of their economy is farming and ranching, maybe mining and oil and gas, and that's New Mexico too, and that's a lot of Denver, or it's a lot of Colorado as well, and probably a lot of the Southwest. But there the difference ended, and a lot of it has to do with Bank of North Dakota. Their economy is thriving, and their small businesses have access to loans, and the Bank of North Dakota targets lending to benefit the public as a whole. They have a loan program for farmers to help them when crops fail or when water doesn't come. They make affordable loans for housing and barns and farm equipment. And in North Dakota, they have the highest per capita percentage of community banks of any state in the nation. And that's because they work with local community banks to support them by doing what they call partnership lending, issuing lines of credit, lower interest, extending it to the banks, and then the people have access to higher levels of credit than they would have if those banks didn't have the Bank of North Dakota to back them. They have a high standard of living, and they have a good educational system. In New Mexico, in regards to our educational system, we say, thank goodness for Mississippi. We are right at the bottom. In spite of the fact that we have a $19.5 billion permanent fund that is substantially dedicated to education in our state. But all we're allowed to spend is the interest that they earn from investing it in private investors and investment firms. And there's a huge fight in our legislature every year. You can't touch the principal, you can't touch the principal. We also have revolving loan funds, and you can't touch the principal on that as well. North Dakota, as you heard, has student loans. And they issue low interest student loans. They refinance student loans, and their young people stay in their state because there's jobs and there's careers, and they get their education there. At an affordable price, so that they're not strapped for life. So anyhow, so I just, those were some of the differences that I noticed right off, and I thought, well, that's really cool. Let's organize a state bank for the state of New Mexico. And then I remembered my legislative experiences. I've been in the legislature a lot on a number of pieces of legislation, and it's not like they say it is in the rule books, I can tell you. And so I think I heard about San Francisco, and that San Francisco was going to do a municipal public bank. And I thought, wow, we should try that. If we could figure out how to do a chartered public bank and do it within the existing laws somehow, I don't know if we can, but if we could do it within the existing laws and not change anything, then maybe that could bring that difference to Santa Fe. Now, Santa Fe has, I think, 83,000 people. That's our population. Denver's like what?
680,000.
So yeah, so it's like that's economy of scale that you're talking here. So we knew it was small, but there's advantages to being small. It's easier to getting things done. People can listen to each other easier. So we decided to pursue that. Craig, I, Elaine, and the people in WeArePeopleHere, and we founded the name Banking on New Mexico. But after we thought about the state bank and moved to a municipal bank, it was really because of that economy of scale that it would be easier to get things done if we could do it within the existing laws and statutes. But Santa Fe is a lot smaller than Denver and most of the communities that are doing it. So we went in 2013 to San Rafael and went to the Public Banking Institute conference there. It was a 3-day thing, and it was fabulous, and there was a lot of technical information, and we got all fired up, and we came back, and we did education, and the following year we had our own symposium. Before that, the mayor invited counselors and city staff and opinion leaders in Santa Fe to come to a 3-hour presentation by the Public Banking Institute chair and members, and then we had the 3-day symposium, educational symposium, and then that was in September. Then in November, the city council approved funding a task feasibility study. They only funded $50,000, which is really small, but so they did that, and it was in March that finally the contract got signed, and then the feasibility study was completed by the end of November, I think. And so the feasibility study, you have to watch this. I'm going to share with you things I've learned. One thing is you have to watch out who pays for things, because sometimes you get what they pay for. And in this case, it was the Economic Development Department of the City of Santa Fe. So our feasibility study was primarily an economic development study. And it is very helpful for submitting an application for a bank charter to know what the financial terrain of your community is, where the deficiencies are, what a niche is for a public bank. But it hardly addressed a public bank operations at all. But it did find, it focused primarily on the internal management of the city's finances, which were terrible at that time. We had huge or a lot of cash reserves for a little town. They were invested poorly, if at all. I think they were mostly sitting in checking accounts. And so they made a bunch of recommendations about improving the cash management system, and as a result of that, the city hired a treasurer, and they hired an investment advisor, and they also hired someone who was a professional finance director for our city. So all those things got implemented over the next 2 years. But the report did say that a city-owned bank could save the city a lot of money, and it could keep money circulating locally by making investments that benefited the community as a whole. It recommended a 3-phase approach. The first was get your own house in order before you take on a public bank. That makes you a credible applicant. That's smart. I don't remember what the second phase was, but it wasn't very much. And then the third phase was 3 years later, which would be about where we are right now in time. And that was to actually apply for a bank charter. And that has not happened. The feasibility study did not address the 5-year business plan, which is part of applying for a bank charter. It didn't address legal questions. It didn't address regulatory questions. It didn't address mission or purpose for the bank. It just kind of was a financial model that said you could save this amount of money if you had a public bank. And they also called the city's financial management a public bank, which I really didn't like very much. Because it didn't have that independence. So, it looked at, and it was over a 7-year plan, and it showed that the city could save $24.6 million if they had a public bank. But some of that was good internal financial management. And they use the same model that I'm part of a team called the Brass Tacks team. It's the nerd team. I'm not really a nerd, but I can translate nerd, and that's really important. And so the brass tacks team is an ad hoc group of people who like to noodle numbers and are interested in banking and interested in city government and finance and all those kinds of things. And so we kind of suspected from speaking with the person that was doing the feasibility study that not much was going to be addressed in terms of a public bank. So we did our own study. And we looked at what the issue was, the biggest for the city at that time, and it was debt. Right around that time, we realized, number one, the economic crisis hit New Mexico later, like 4 or 5 years later. But when it hit really hard, and it coincided with excessive bond debt. So the interest, the income that we were earning on our gross receipts and our taxes just went down, down, down. However, our bond debt was up really high. It didn't go away, and we couldn't pay it. So we were really in a very bad situation. But anyhow, so our brass tacks team said, well, what if we took the city's debt and we used it to set up a public bank, and we refinanced the city's debt at lower interest, and you know, fooled around with the rate and the time periods and whatever. And so this is what we found in our 5-year model, which is not a perfect model, but it's, you know, it's pretty good. We took the same $10 million to invest in a bank, plus the deposits the city had at the time, which was about $220 million. And we refinanced over a 5-year period, $83 million in bond debt. And we did it at 4% interest, which was lower than what the city was paying at that time. Well, we saved the city $1.4 million in debt service, and we reduced their total debt by $4.8 million. And the bank made a profit over that 5-year period of $10.5 million. How much did we invest in the bank? Do you remember? 10. So they got it back in 5 years, right? So they could have paid that back, or they could have taken that $10 million and used it to help invest in solar or affordable housing or financing more of the city's debt, because the debt goes out year after year after year. Bond debt, it gets extended. Typically, they're 15 years to 30-year cycles. So when you're stuck over a long period of time with bond debt. So we learned that a public bank can earn a profit, it can save the city money, and it can do it in 1 year. I don't know what Denver's debt is or how they do it, but that's something you could do. We also learned that if it's not an official report paid for the city, that nobody listens to it very much, or they quickly dismiss it. But officials elsewhere listened to it, and they've been picking up the idea, and they've realized, gosh, we could refinance some of our own debt. So in June through October, this is public knowledge, so I don't think I'm sharing anything out of school. The city of Santa Fe experienced some of that very serious problem I was telling you about, with having too much debt and not enough income coming in. It's something a lot of us have to deal with. Debt can really strangle you. And so what happened in our city was that we had to cut our budget by 1/3 in 1 year, and we had to cut our staff by 1/3. And then the following year, we had to cut that budget by 1/3. So you can imagine what the tenor was in Santa Fe during those 2 years. We're just kind of coming to the end of that now. And because we had all this debt we owed private investors that we couldn't pay, the new financial management team that the city hired took our spare cash and paid it off. So what happens when you take your money and you pay something off? Do you have it anymore? No. So that made it harder to start a public bank, right? because we didn't have, I mean, they spent $60 million paying down bond debt and getting out of trouble with the IRS, and they mismanaged some bond funds because they were desperate. They took bond funds that were designated for a specific purpose for parks and recreation, and they spent it for employee salaries so they wouldn't have to let employees go. But then they got audited, and that was a no-no and a bad thing to do. And the IRS said, well, we're going to fine you $13 million unless you can make this right. So that, they didn't have to pay that $13 million. They just had to pay off all their bond debt because, well, actually they couldn't borrow anything because their credit was bad or going to be bad very soon. And they had a lot of projects lined up off into the future. Now, in a city like Denver, that can happen here too, but hopefully you've got more cushion. Albuquerque did it. I know the county of Bernalillo got themselves into the same kind of trouble. Albuquerque's a pretty big city. Because of that, the feasibility study that didn't tell us how to set up a public bank, the steps, the legal, the regulatory, the business plan, and all of that, there was obviously no money to do that, right? And our city councilors and our city staff and the people were all worried about what to do and how to go forward. And me, being on the brass tacks team, thought, well, we've got to find a way to keep this going forward somehow. So what can we do? So we wrote a resolution, and we did it, I think, in April or May, and it was to set up a volunteer task force of experts, bankers, lawyers, financial people, people from the community. And then we listed all the things that hadn't been done in the original feasibility study and asked if they would look at that. Well, because our city was still struggling so much, it didn't get on the agenda for quite a while. It didn't get approved really until May of this year. And so the task force began meeting in August, and they've been meeting for 6 months now, and they're in the stage of the final report that they're going to write regarding it. And so let's see. Oh, there's another little thing I wanted to put in there. The mayor, who was our primary advocate, decided to do something else for his legacy. And he decided to do a revolving loan fund called the Verde Fund, and we just were kind of left high and dry. But that was kind of a gift, and I recommend it to you that you're really much stronger if you have the support of the full city council, which was what we did when we got our resolution passed. Every single councilor stood strongly in support of it, to have a task force. And I would suggest that would be good. Now, another strategic thing that happened with us in Santa Fe was that our beloved Craig Barnes died of cancer, kind of right in the middle of our campaign. And any of you who knew Craig knew that he was a statesman, he was a diplomat, he was a civil rights attorney here that ended segregation in Colorado. Many of you don't know that with his landmark action. But he died in November of 2016, and it affected our hearts, it affected our energy. And he was our most credible speaker, and he had the most influence. So the rest of us were left to kind of carry on after he died, and we were not 1/10 as sexy as Craig was, you know, or articulate. So that was another thing that happened, and stuff will happen, but you know, you just have to keep going. That's the thing, you just keep going. You just figure out what is it you can do with what you've got. How can you keep the conversation going? How can you keep moving? So one of the things that happened when we wrote our resolution to enable a task force to study a public bank was that we listed the finance department, a representative from the finance department of the city of Santa Fe as an ex officio member, which meant that they would be available, but they wouldn't be a regular voting participant. But when it went to city council, the process before it got introduced, they became actual members. Well, the finance department did not support the idea of a public bank. And so at every task force meeting, what the task force heard is, it's not necessary, we can do it just as well, just as cheaply, you don't need a public bank. And that had a very demoralizing factor. So who's on the task force? It matters a lot. We anticipated that, but we weren't able to stop it from happening. One of the things that happened that you should know about is that the city of Santa Fe paid for a very respected law firm to do a memorandum on the legal aspects of a public bank, looking at bank law, depository law, city and state law, and everything. And it's a really good memorandum, and what it says is there is no unsurmountable obstacle with setting up a public bank. It says that pretty clearly. And that was done by Virtue at Nichoe, and if you're interested, you can find it under resources on the Public Banking Institute website. It should be helpful for you in Colorado. The laws are generally a lot the same from state to state, and there's only some parts that are different. So challenges that a public bank runs into is that banking law and regulations for the last 100 years have been established for privately owned banks with private investors. They don't really have the model for a public ownership of a bank, and there's a lot of technical little things that have to be wiggled around or through or changed. The requirement of FDIC membership is, most of us involved with public banking think is pretty silly, and that's because FDIC insurance only insures up to $250,000, and there's only one deposit or maybe 2 or 3 depositors in a public bank. That would be the state or the city, and they're depositing way more than $250,000, and so that's another obstacle. And then acceptance by the Federal Reserve, and then the state depository and investment laws for municipalities and states. They're getting some flexibility with them. One thing that is great is that we have a state treasurer who's a very strong supporter of a public bank and is interested in having a state bank to fund infrastructure and facilities. And we didn't introduce it this session because in New Mexico we have a 30-day session and a 60-day session, and we just needed more time to prepare. So I went to the task force meeting Wednesday night in Santa Fe, and they were doing a group edit of the final report, and I have the report here for you. It's not finalized yet because they only got halfway through the report, but they made 3 recommendations. One, that due to legal issues and all the challenges, that the scale of Santa Fe and the challenges they've got right now, they're not able to work their way through the regulatory and legal process. It would just be too costly for a city that doesn't have the money right now anyhow. Another thing was that they did support the city supporting a state public bank. They didn't describe what that would look like, and to my way of knowing, there's at least 5 different models that a state bank could take. And they also recommended, which was off task, and I objected to it, they recommend the city look at ways to improve the local economy by networking with existing private and non-profit funding sources. I mean, it's a good idea, but it just wasn't in the resolution. So I would make these recommendations if you decide to do your own task force. Rather than starting with legal and technical issues, I would suggest that you identify what the unmet needs are in your community that are not being met by existing private and nonprofit and governmental funding sources, and then identify the need, which is your niche for developing a 5-year business model for a public bank. And then you also need to come to agreement on what a public bank is. That came up at our last meeting. A public bank is a bank that's owned by a government. That doesn't give you very much information, and our task force really struggled with that. What did it mean? Would we be the Sparkassen model, like in Germany, where private investors and public investors all put their money in together for the public good, or would it be a public bank that funded infrastructure, or would it be a partnership model like the Bank of North Dakota? Would it accept cannabis deposits? We have cannabis in New Mexico too, although it's not recreational. So another thing is that is a challenge in a small community, although we had some really good people on our task force. We only had 8 people, and I think San Francisco has like about 20 people on their task force, and that's maybe a good idea because you get more diversity of opinions. But the thing is, the experts we had were like bankers who banked in, with private investors, and we had regulators that were used to working with private chartered banks and their regulations, and we had people that didn't really know that much about the benefits of a public bank or how it worked. They didn't know the technical stuff. We had 2 lawyers that didn't know that much about banks or banking. We had 1 lawyer that really knew his stuff, but he was the facilitator and he tried to stay neutral. So maybe if you have more, and with a bigger city, you have an opportunity to get more voices in for what a public bank could be, what its vision, its purpose could be. Because what happened with our task force is they jumped into all the nuts and bolts, which is what we recommended that they do. That was our mistake. And then so what they ran into were challenges, and they didn't have the vision or the purpose for why a public bank was so important. So that would be one thing I would recommend to you. And they didn't understand the idea of legacy that a public bank can do for your community. It's not something that just solves a problem right now. It's something that can just change life forever in the communities that make that commitment and fight to set it up. Keep in mind that it's a new idea. It takes time to reach out to people. You need people with good credibility in your community who can really speak to it. You need the nerds who can do the noodling of the numbers. And also a lot can happen on the way in your process. But the important thing is to keep going. That's my message for you.
You want to take a few questions?
Are there?
Yes, we do have some.
This is kind of nice, this soft rug here. I like it. It's like one of those that you put by the bathtub or the sink.
So I'd like to know, in trying to get a public bank started, shouldn't the credit unions shouldn't they be right there? Because in the North Dakota model, they are just, you know, they really do well with the support of the main bank, and even on a city level. Shouldn't that be true?
Absolutely. However, the bank that we were proposing in Santa Fe was the size of a hamster, smaller actually than most of the community banks that are in the city. Actually, we only have one state chartered bank in Santa Fe anymore. But if you're looking at a city like Denver, where you have a lot more capacity, then you really can partner, like the Bank of North Dakota does, to help give them credit so that they can extend credit at more affordable rates. You can do risk sharing and credit sharing.
That rich guy in Omaha, I can't remember his name. Yeah, that's it. If he was behind public banking, how would he argue that to his drinking and golfing buddies?
It'd be getting the poor people off his back. Or their backs, I don't know. They're vested interests. They're the ones that profit off the people. As Craig used to say, could you hear that big sucking sound? You know, our lifeblood is just being siphoned away. It's a form of debt enslavement. It's a new form of slavery.
I was wondering, how did your committee keep the rest of the people in Santa Fe up to date on what your committee was doing? Did you have a public outreach?
You know, it was exasperating. It was good and it was exasperating. You're talking about the task force, right? They were not required to involve the public in any of their hearings, but they were open hearings. And so they met every 3 weeks, which is pretty amazing, from August on. And they would meet and they would do research in between meetings. They had a regulatory subcommittee, they had a capitalization subcommittee, they had a governance subcommittee, and one other, and I can't remember what it was. But they would come and they would report, and then at the end they would give the audience 5 minutes to make comments, which was good. And then we had one public hearing where all the bankers showed up and objected strenuously, and the public showed up and was in support of it. And then when the final report comes, and they also had a hearing in front of the Finance Committee, but the public was not allowed to comment. That was just a presentation. And then they're going to have another public hearing where the public will be able to comment after the report. That'll be at the end of their final report.
Did you get much help from National Public Banking Institute or North Dakota State Bank on how to set up feasibility study and all that?
Well, I'm on the board of the Public Banking Institute, and so I got a lot of informal help, and I'm good friends with Ellen, and I'd say, what do you think about this? And she'd say, well, this and that. And then on our breasts, and then on our, but the thing is that what happens often is a lot of these committees and reports and whatever, they happen behind closed doors. And then they give you their results, and then you get to comment after them. There are teams that are being assembled now who really are genuine experts that are submitting proposals to cities and towns and states when they do requests for information or requests for proposals, and the whole ante has been stepped up in terms of expertise. But yes, expertise is needed. On our brass tacks team, we had a man who was just very interested in financing and banking. He was really interested in it. And then we had a woman who used to do HUD financing, and she learned how to do creative, low-interest financing and qualifying and things like that. So she did a lot of the economic modeling, and he did the banker piece. And then we had another person on our task force who attended every city meeting that ever was and knew everything that was happening, good or bad, with the city. And that was very helpful.
There's a question.
Okay, this may have already been addressed, so please ignore if it has, and if it's too large, don't answer it either. So about home mortgages, would it be possible to arrange things in such a way so that people could pay in 10 years and have a very low interest rate? And I've even heard some people who are involved in this say if that ever really took off, that the people involved might even be killed because there's just so much writing on it. I mean, can something like that be fashioned? Where you just pay for the...
Depends on how expensive the house is and how big the mortgage payments are and how much you can pay, I think.
Yes, I understand that, but I mean, if you have a $400,000 house and you're going to pay for it for 30 years and you only have a $1,700 a month loan, instead of having 16 of that go to interest, could it be made that, you know, it all gets squished together and...
Well, you can do short-term...
You pay enough just for the people to, like, run the business.
Mm-hmm. I don't know the answer. I mean, I don't see why it couldn't be done. You know, it just, they like it a lot better if they double their profit.
Okay, well, let's, thank you. You got a question?
Yeah.
All right, this will be our last question.
I'm curious. So I've seen a lot of I've been involved with activism for about 20 years now, and you know, you would go to the city councils and the politicians, and we could go through all the niceties, but it's pretty apparent to me that at least the majority of them are just overtly corrupt, and in spite of the nice things that they say, or you know, they do the niceties and all that. What sense did you get were, in terms of the percentage of the people you were dealing with that were legitimately interested in this, and and what percentage of them do you think were just, you know, blowing smoke? You know what I'm saying? So it seems like we need to deal with some of the reality of the situation, because we go through these processes as if there's some sort of, as if we're dealing with a fair system. Mm-hmm. And she mentioned assassination. I mean, that's also a part of how the world works. And we're not being honest with ourselves and with our communities about what the reality is that we're dealing with. And that these, some of the, you said going through all of the regulatory processes and how those are actually written in order to prevent things like this from occurring. And there's a group called Community Rights Network, which deals with, you know, getting at some of these root issues. So what are your thoughts on that in terms of your process that you went through, that how much of it was just BS and how much of it was, you know, people that really cared? Sorry, the wrong question.
Well, I mean, you need to understand that banking laws and regulations were written for banks that were managed for private investors, and that's how it's been for 100 years. And that's not an accident that those are the kind of banks that we have. We used to have public banks, and the private investor banks really ran them off. They made some mistakes. I'm sure the public banks made mistakes. There were counterfeiting problems and other things that happened along the way, but mostly it was pressure from the private for-profit banks that really put KO'd the public banks. And so I can tell you that our city councilors were very sincerely interested in it, and I think they're going to be disappointed to hear the results of the task force. I hope to keep engaging them, and as far as like the regulations and licensing, I couldn't, you know, they issued a memo that was so inaccurate, and I don't know if it was intentional or just lack of legal knowledge in those areas. So I couldn't say, but I do. And who else would you be thinking of?
Well, just a lot of the politicians themselves, you know, I've seen it with city councils where, you know, people are just, you know, they're nodding their heads or whatever, but at the end of the day, they don't really care. You know, it just seems like, or they'll be pragmatic. They say, well, we're not going to pick this battle or whatever.
Yeah, it might be pragmatic, or they might have a lot of other battles. It might be that we need to really lift their vision up and have...
It's not pragmatic if you consider the environmental costs, all of the other costs to society that we're inferring.
Yeah,
it's not,
I mean, it's just happening on every level. Right. It's happening on every level, but it's getting paid for by the financial services industry.